Hello students, how are you all? Hope all of you all are doing quite well, as can be said about me here. I would like to ask you one question. I know I may not get an answer, but still I ask you a question, a very simple one. How many of you all have heard the name of the movie Mr. India? You can ask your parents because Mr. India is a movie which was released while your parents were in college. The story of Mr. India is that a scientist a scientist was working on a project and he invents a watch that can make him invisible. Yeah. So today we are going to read a story, Footprints Without Feet, from our English textbook by the same name, Footprints Without Feet. Let's read and find out how did the invisible man first became visible. Why was he wandering the streets? But can a man become invisible? This is the story of a scientist who discovers how to make himself invisible. Does he use or misuse his discovery? Isn't it? Man has always been fascinated by things which seem impossible. But with time and with effort, seemingly impossible things have become possible. Man wanted to fly in the sky, and today it is all the more possible by various gadgets. Leave alone the helicopter, leave alone the aeroplane. There are certain gadgets which can be used as flying devices, sailing devices. Man has conquered the sky. It was because of his imagination, it was because of his desire that man can do that. So there is a possibility that if we can invent some way in which humans can turn invisible, if suppose you get the power of making yourself invisible, what would you do? Would you play pranks? Would you be up to mischief? Or would you be a good Samaritan? A supernatural hero? What would you do? Let's read the story and find out what the scientist did when he became invisible. The two boys started in surprise at the fresh muddy imprints of a pair of bare feet. What was a barefooted man doing on the steps of a house in the middle of London? And where was the man? As they gazed, a remarkable sight met their eyes. A fresh footmark appeared from nowhere. Further footprints followed, and after another, descending the steps and progressing down the street, the boys followed, fascinated, until the muddy impressions became fainter and fainter, and at last disappeared altogether. Boys will be boys. They were curious to note fresh muddy footprints on the steps. They were just wondering what a man is doing in the middle of London without a footwear, walking bare feet on the streets of London. London is a very cold place, isn't it? And as they were wondering, as they were watching, they saw another fresh footprint, and another, and then they decided to follow the footprints until the muddy footprints became fainter and fainter. What would you do in such a circumstance? Would you shout bhoot, bhoot and run away? Isn't it? We would be scared out of our skins if all of a sudden we see footprints, because we are so much into watching horror movies, listening to horror stories. Our minds would start working towards the supernatural. The explanation of the mystery was really simple enough. The bewildered boys had been following a scientist who had just discovered how to make the human body transparent. Okay, what is the human body made up of? Of various fluids, of solid flesh, bones, skin, plasma, blood, so forth and so on. How can the entire thing become invisible? But the scientist had discovered something, and he was able to invent a sort of a medicine which made the entire human body transparent. Not to disappear, but to become transparent. Griffin, the scientist, had carried out experiment after experiment to prove that the human body could become invisible. Finally, he swallowed certain rare drugs, and his body became as transparent as a sheet of glass, though it also remained as solid as glass. So, though he made his body transparent, he did not make his body to disappear or become thin air. It was as transparent and as solid as glass. Brilliant scientist though he was, Griffin was rather a lawless person. His landlord disliked him and tried to eject him. In revenge, Griffin set fire to the house. See, the first instance where we can say that Griffin is a lawless person, what did he do? He set fire to his landlord's property, the rented house in which he was living. Why? Because the landlord did not like Griffin's, because he ejected him. Griffins took out revenge by burning down his house. To get away without being seen, he had to remove his clothes. Thus, it was that he became a homeless wanderer without clothes, without money, and quite invisible, until he happened to step in some mud and left footprints as he walked. So now we know what the scientist is doing on the street, how he happened to come to this particular place, and where are the footprints coming from. So, though the scientist was an excellent scientist, we can say he is an excellent scientist, he's a brilliant scientist because of his invention. This could have been used for military purpose, for espionage. But look at what he is doing. The first criminal activity that he did was to set his landlord's house on fire. And to evade being arrested, he had to take off his clothes and walk the streets of London bare body. So he became a man without home and without clothes. He escaped easily enough from the boys who followed his footsteps in London. But his adventures were by no means over. He had chosen a bad time of the year to wander about London without clothes. It was midwinter. The air was bitterly cold, and he could not do without clothes. Instead of walking about the streets, he decided to slip into a big London store for warmth. So, the big mistake that Griffin did, he chose the wrong time of the year to go bare body, to walk the streets of London without clothes. It was winter time. It was very cold. Though he became invisible, he was still exposed to the elements of nature. He was still affected by the elements of nature. He still felt cold. People could still hurt him, injure him, because he was as solid as anything else, as solid as a body that we can see, a human body that we can see. Closing time arrived, and as soon as the doors were shut, Griffin was able to give himself the pleasure of clothing and feeding himself without regard to expense. The second criminal activity he is doing here. He broke open boxes and wrappers and fitted himself out with warm clothes. Soon, with shoes and an overcoat and a wide brimmed hat, he became a fully dressed and visible person. In the kitchen of the restaurant, he found cold meat and coffee, and he followed up the meal with sweets and wine taken from the grocery store. Finally, he settled down to sleep on a pile of quilts. If only Griffin had managed to wake up in good time, all might have been well. As it was, he did not wake up until the assistants were already arriving next morning. When he saw a couple of them approaching, he panicked and began to run. They naturally gave chase. In the end, he was able to escape only by quickly taking off his newly found clothes. So once more, he found himself invisible but naked in the chill January air. This time, he decided to try the stock of a theatrical company in the hope of finding not only clothes but also something that would hide the empty space above his shoulders. Shivering with cold, he hurried to Drury Lane, the center of the theatre world. He soon found a suitable shop. He made his way invisible upstairs and came out a little later, wearing bandages around his forehead, dark glasses, false nose, big bushy side whiskers, and a large hat. To escape without being seen, he carelessly attacked the shopkeeper from behind, after which he robbed him of all the money he could find. So finally, Griffin found a nice, cozy, warm store, and they, when the store closed, when the closing time of the store came, when the storekeepers and all the attendants left the store, he got himself some good clothes, a good meal, though it was cold, nice wine, and then he slept under the quilt. And he was a bit late to arise. Had he had awoken a little earlier, he would not have been caught. But when the attendants came, they saw him sleeping, and next morning, when he saw a couple of them approaching, he panicked and then he began to run. They, of course, they will naturally give him a chase because they were surprised how could somebody be staying inside the store, and they chased him. In the end, he was able to escape only how? By quickly removing all his newly found clothes. So once again, he was invisible, but again he was naked in the January air. So next, he decided that he would go to a theatre, try the stock of a theatre company Perhaps because he thought that he would be able not only to find clothes but also to find something with which he could cover his head, his neck, his face. So he found the clothes at Drury Lane at the theatre. So soon he found a suitable shop, and then he made his way invisible upstairs. And again, here, what did he do? He attacked the shopkeeper from behind and robbed him of all the money. Eager to get away from crowded London, he took a train to the village of Epping, where he booked 2 rooms at the local inn. The arrival of a stranger at an inn in winter was in any case an unusual event. A stranger of such uncommon appearance set all tongues wagging. It's a phrase. Setting all tongues wagging means everybody in the village began to talk because a stranger, first of all, a stranger visiting during the winter season, it is off season. Nobody usually visits uh, here in London during the off season or winter season. And the stranger looked so different because he had his face all bandaged up. So everybody were talking about the stranger. Who is the stranger? What is he? Why has he come? A stranger of such uncommon appearance set all tongues wagging. Mrs. Hall, the landlord's wife, made every effort to be friendly, but Griffin had no desire to talk and told her, "My reason for coming to Epping is a desire for solitude." Naturally, the landlady was very curious, so she wanted to talk to Griffins and try to be friendly with him. But Griffin very bluntly and straightforwardly told her that he wants to be left alone. That is the sole purpose he came here, to this cottage, to this village. I do not wish to be disturbed in my work. Besides, an accident has affected my face. So he gave a cover up story for his face being covered with bandages. Satisfied that her guest was an eccentric scientist, and in view of the fact that he had paid her in advance, Mrs. Hall was prepared to excuse his strange habits and irritable temper. But the stolen money did not last long, and presently Griffin had to admit that he had no more ready cash. He pretended, however, that he was expecting a check to arrive at any moment. Shortly afterwards, a curious episode occurred. Very early in the morning, a clergyman and his wife were awakened by noises in their study. Creeping downstairs, they heard the chink of money being taken from the clergyman's desk. Without making any noise, and with a poker perhaps firmly in his hand, the clergyman flung open the door. "Surrender." What is a poker? A poker is a iron device. It is used to poke the stoves, the charcoal in the fire, to keep the fire burning. Otherwise, the fire will collect ash and slowly the charcoal will die. The fire will die down. So, to keep the fire alive, they use a poker, a metal and especially an iron rod bent like a hook to poke the stove. So the clergyman took this poker in his hand and he opened the door, and what did he shout? "Surrender." Then to his amazement, he realized that the room appeared to be empty. See the word used here? The room appeared to be empty. He and his wife looked under the desk and behind the curtains and even up the chimney. You know, there was a belief that Santa is around. It was December, no, it was January time. Santa must have come and gone. But still, they felt that a thief might have used the chimney to escape, or perhaps is hiding there up the chimney. So there wasn't any sign of anybody. Yet the desk had been opened and the housekeeping money was missing. Extraordinary affair, the clergyman kept saying for the rest of the day. The clergyman, the pastor, the priest, whoever, the pastor, he felt he was sure that somebody was in the room because the desk was open and the money was gone. But when he opened the room appeared to be vacant, to be empty. So full evening, full day, he was thinking of the event, what might have happened. How could somebody get in and get out without being noticed? The landlord and his wife were up very early and were surprised to see the scientist's door wide open. Usually, it was shut and locked, and he was furious if anybody entered his room. The opportunity seemed too good to be missed. They peeped round the door, saw nobody, and decided to investigate. The bedcloth, the bedcloths were cold, showing that the scientist must have been up for some time. And stranger still, the clothes and bandages that he always wore were lying about the room. So this landlord and the landlady, they acted as detectives. They were very curious to know who this man is, what work does he do. Whenever they tried to approach him, whenever they knocked the door, he was very rude, and he very rudely told them that he wanted to be left alone. So now that they found the door open and nobody inside, they went to investigate and see how they found out that the scientist was up early. They felt the bed. The bed was not warm. The bed was quite cold. So it must have been some time that the scientist was up and away. Mrs. Hall almost fell down. Sorry. All of a sudden, Mrs. Hall heard a sniff close to her ear. A moment later, the hat on the bedpost leapt up and dashed itself into her face. Then the bedroom chair became alive. Springing into the air, it charged straight at her, legs foremost. As she and her husband turned away in terror, the extraordinary chair pushed them both out of the room and then appeared to slam and lock the door after them. Mrs. Hall almost fell down the stairs in hysterics. She was convinced that the room was haunted by spirits and that the stranger had somehow caused these to enter into her furniture. My poor mother used to sit in that chair, she moaned. To think it should rise up against me now. So, Mrs. Hall, who's Mrs. Hall? The landlady. She feels that the room was haunted, that some evil spirits had possessed not only the room but the furnitures in the room. She felt more hurt at the thought that the way the chair behaved, it was a chair that shooed away Mr. and Mrs. Hall, the landlord and the landlady. She said that her mother used to sit on that chair, so she's wondering whether whose spirit has entered into the chair. She's feeling so hurt that she began to sob and cry. My poor mother used to sit on that chair, she moaned. To think it would rise up against me now. The feeling among the neighbors was that the trouble was caused by witchcraft. But, witchcraft or not, when news of the burglary at the clergyman's home became known, the strange scientist was strongly suspected of having had a hand in it. Suspicion grew even stronger when he suddenly produced some ready cash, though he had admitted not long before that he had no money. The village constable was secretly sent for, Instead of waiting for the constable, Mrs. Hall went to the scientist, who had somehow mysteriously appeared from his empty bedroom. I want to know what you have been doing to my chair upstairs, she demanded. And I want to know how is it you came out of an empty room and how you entered a locked room. The scientist was always quick tempered. Now he became furious. You don't understand who or what I am, he shouted. Very well, I'll show you. Suddenly, he threw off bandages, whiskers, spectacles, and even nose. It took him only a minute to do this. The horrified people in the bar found themselves staring at a headless man. Mr. Jaffers, the constable, now arrived, and was quite surprised to find that he had to arrest a man without a head. But Jaffers was not easily prevented from doing his duty. If a magistrate's warrant ordered a person's arrest, then the person had to be arrested, with or without his head. There followed a remarkable scene as the policeman tried to get hold of a man who was becoming more and more invisible as he threw off one garment after another. Finally, a shirt flew into the air, and the constable found himself struggling with someone he could not see at all. Some people tried to help him, but found themselves hit by blows that seemed to come from nowhere. In the end, Jaffers was knocked unconscious as he made a last attempt to hold on to the unseen scientist. They were nervous, excited cries of "Hold him!" But this was easier said than done. Griffin had shaken himself free, and no one knew where to lay hands on him. A story by H. G. Wells. If you want to know what happened further, you can read the book titled The Invisible Man by the same author, H. G. Wells.